About a year ago, my wife and I, when I was working at Sojourners in Washington, D.C., and I was working on justice survivals and church relations at Sojourners, my wife Amy and I felt called to start a new church in Washington, D.C. And part of that calling for me was born out of not a frustration with my previous job and what I was doing. I feel like I had the greatest job in the world, and I was traveling around the U.S. and meeting all these amazing pastors and preachers who were doing amazing work in their churches and in their city. But I felt like I was getting on a plane and trying to tell other pastors and churches how to be good Christians when I wasn't living that in my own backyard. And I think part of my calling to that was to say, okay, how can I become not only a better pastor, but a better husband and a better father and a better neighbor at the same time? And I found that that was a struggle that a lot of people who were living in Washington, D.C. were facing as they worked on national and international issues. My wife and I had a hard time connecting with a church for several years in Washington, D.C. because D.C. is a place of transients, and it's a very divided city. There's the folks who come in to take from D.C. for their mission that's beyond D.C., even if it's a great mission. And there's the folks who have always lived in D.C. who feel oftentimes overlooked by the national conversation about what's going on. It was about last April where my wife and I began to just take the risk of starting a church. And it's a very frightful thing to have a family and to say, you know what, rather than taking a salary somewhere else, we're going to just step out on faith and to do this. And so we just opened up our home one Sunday morning and just began to meet with a core group of folks over the course of the summer for about 4 or 5 months and begin to pray and discern, God, what is it that you're saying to us? What is it that you're calling us to do? Where are you already at work in our community? And the vision that God really gave to us from the very beginning was Jeremiah 29, where Jeremiah really issues a challenge to the folks who are in exile to really seek the peace of the city, to build roots, to settle down, to buy houses and to start families there. And he said that in the peace of the city, they will find their own peace, that they were inextricably linked. And it was a good challenge for Amy and I, who felt like maybe we're just passing through Washington, D.C. And it was a challenge to some other folks who felt the same way as well, who wanted to get involved in a church or community or make a difference in their neighborhood, but they didn't have any community. For me, as a pastor who's committed to doing the work of justice, my commitment to justice as a pastor starts with forming a community of disciples. That I really believe that mission happens best in the context of community. And so for me, it was a challenge. I had a calling to ministry at an early age at 16 and did pastoral ministry in Boston for 5 years in a poor urban neighborhood there. But for me, my disposition is more as an activist to say, okay, what's the issue that's going on in the city? And then how do I begin to get involved myself and then mobilize volunteers around that? But here in starting the district church in Washington, D.C., God was basically saying, Aaron, you need to step back. You're so focused on trying to change the world yourself. I've called all these people to Washington, D.C. to change the world, and they don't have community, much less Christ-centered community. And we need pastors and leaders who are going to help equip them to discern their God-given mission in life and figure out how to live that out in community. And so that's what we've begun to do. And in September, we began to meet in a school, and we're about to do our full launch in the spring to really launch our outreach ministry and our kids ministry. One of the things, as we began to pray about what can we get involved in the city? We live in Columbia Heights, and that's where our church is, which is a neighborhood in Boston. It's right between Howard University and the zoo. And it's the most diverse neighborhood of Washington, D.C. There's 130 nations represented right around that area. And so we really realized, okay, that the nations have come here. We used to be talking about missions of going overseas. I grew up as a missionary kid in Liberia and Kuwait, and so I've always had this notion that to do mission internationally is to go there. And here we are in the nation's capital, obviously seeing that diversity in our own community. And it's not only a diverse community racially and ethnically, but also socioeconomically. It used to be the murder capital neighborhood of the murder capital. and has begun to transition. So now it's about a third white, a third African American, and a third Latino. And so we began to say, what would it look like for us to be a church that reflects our neighborhood and reflects our city? One of the things that's been going on in DC recently, well, not just recently, but over the last 30, 40 years, but has really come into the national media spotlight recently, is the issue of education. DC is the most educated city in the country, and yet has some of the lowest performing schools. And for us, we just saw that as a complete contradiction. And God brought us a lot of school teachers at the very beginning, and we probably have 20 to 25 school teachers in our congregation. And so we began to pray about that issue and how we could get involved. And so as we stepped out on where we're going to meet publicly, we really intentionally wanted to meet in a school so that what we were giving in terms of our rent could help hire an extra aide in a classroom rather than going to some cause that we weren't really connected with. And so one of the things that we're praying about is, how do we get involved in the education crisis in our city? How do we help support the teachers who are called to be in really tough urban environments, who oftentimes feel very alone? But also, how is it that we can begin to break this down on a church level, where we can adopt a school, where each individual in our church can mentor a kid, and where we can use our voices to speak on behalf of those who don't have voices, to decision makers in our city or other places. And so that's one of the things that we've begun to get involved in as we've started this new church.